Oh, hi there. I was just putting together this Apple II puzzle. One of the many items you could get in the Apple gift catalog back in the day. You could also buy Apple branded kites, clothes, belt buckles, and even cigarette lighters. But it's a more significant item that I want to look at today. A computer that led to early success at Apple and made Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak young multimillionaires. That computer was the Apple II.
And here it is in its original glory, truly a work of art. This particular unit has a serial number of 5571. This meant at the time it was sold there were less than 6,000 Apple users in the world. Considering there's been about 500 million iPhones sold, that's pretty crazy to think about. Now the computer was groundbreaking. It was what Apple described as a complete, ready-to-use computer at a time when most were still sold in kits. It was one of the first computers to be in a plastic case, to come with standard video support, and to display low and high-res color graphics. Part of the brilliance of its design was in its openness. No screws held the lid in place. You could simply pop it right off and access the motherboard and expandability slots. This led to endless possibilities, and as a result, thousands of add-on cards were built and are still being built, and this helped keep the Apple II series in production for 16 years. Now before I talk more about this machine, let's put things in context. Let's go back for a moment to 1976. This was an important time in vintage computer and gaming history. This was also an important time in the disco scene, but I'll let someone else cover that topic. Now by 76, the Altair 8800 had been on the market for about a year. The Altair is considered by many to be the first successful personal computer, although technically speaking there were others around before it, such as the MCM70, developed in 1973. It was also during this time that a small fledgling company called Microsoft had written BASIC interpreters for the Altair. Terminals became available for it, and for the first time there was a widely available personal computer that could actually be made to do useful things. Soon other companies joined the personal computer revolution by releasing their own computers, like the MOS Kim-1, the first computer to use the legendary 6502 microprocessor. This computer also gave birth to Microchess, the first software title to sell over 10,000 copies for home computers. And best of all, it only required 1 kilobyte of memory. Now that's what I call optimized code. There was also Southwest Technical Products Corporation, who released an early competitor to the Altair called the 6800.
Now this is a 6809 model released a couple years later, but it has a similar appearance. You can see, unlike the Altair, they did away with all those intimidating switches and lights and opted for 2 big buttons. And this thing was built tough. The case feels like it's made out of sheet metal. Very durable, like it's meant to survive a war. But what really distinguished this computer from others is the fact that it had a monitor program called NICBug. So when you booted it up with a terminal, you had immediate access to several functions. A very early example of a plug-and-play computer. But it still didn't have a wide appeal, in part because it was sold in a kit. And you did have fully assembled computers like the polymorphic System 8813, but a computer like that with 3 disk drives cost over $4 grand, and this was in 1977.
Enter in Steve Wozniak, an engineer at Hewlett-Packard who on the side had recently developed the prototype for Atari's Breakout. Steve Jobs was commissioned by Nolan Bushnell to create it and got the help of Woz to complete it. Soon after joining the Homebrew Computer Club, he made his first personal computer, something that he could play with and share with other club members. That computer was the Apple I. It was actually just a modified terminal that he had built earlier, but with a few tweaks including the addition of the new low-cost MOS 6502. Now the Apple I was very simple. It produced only black and white text and printed at only 60 characters a second. But that wasn't unexpected since the terminal was only meant to communicate over a modem, and the modems could only process 30 characters a second. The Steves tried selling the computer to HP, Atari, and Commodore, but nobody wanted it, and they ended up producing about 200 Apple I's in total. Soon Woz was already planning the Apple II, and he had a gamer's mindset when designing it. He wanted a computer that could display color graphics, produce sound effects, and that programmers could write games for in software. This was a huge departure from having to build them using hardware like he did with Breakout. One of his goals was to actually replicate the game Breakout using software. Well, it worked. He wrote Breakout in about 30 minutes using the machine's integer BASIC language. Now the fact that BASIC was stored in ROM was a huge deal. This meant that users could immediately start to write and save their own programs in a user-friendly language. There was also a mini-assembler stored in memory for users to develop and debug assembly language programs. But for larger programs, the use of third-party assemblers like Merlin would be needed. Merlin was extremely popular and had several versions released throughout the years. Incidentally, the original Terminator used Apple II assembly code when we see the world through the Terminator's eyes. The code was actually borrowed from an article in Nibble magazine. Now, the Apple II was one of the so-called 1977 Trinity of computers, the others being the Commodore PET and the TRS-80. Apple II sales were actually slow to start, selling under 1,000 units in '77 and under 10,000 by the end of '78. However, three key events soon occurred that would lead to big sales. One of those was when Steve Jobs helped win a bidding war with MEC to secure the Apple II's place in state schools. Computers soon became a vital classroom tool, and the Apple II dominated the North American education sector for much of the '80s and even part of the '90s. Another event was Apple's disk drive support. Originally, the only storage option you had were cassette tapes, but they were slow and unreliable, so Woz created the Apple II disk drive and controller card in '78. Now, at the time, controllers usually had around 50 chips. Woz's design has a fraction of that, and it runs incredibly fast. Now, this is an early production drive, the 1050th one made, created by Shugart Associates, but Apple soon outsourced the drives for cost savings and would go on to sell over 1 million of them. The last event was the release of the world's first electronic spreadsheet, VisiCalc. It was created and released in '79 by Dan Bricklin and Bob Frankston. Many businesses bought Apple IIs just to use this software. VisiCalc soon became the first ever killer app. It was subsequently ported to many other platforms and inspired the likes of Lotus 123 and Excel, which even to this day looks remarkably similar to the VisiCalc interface. One limitation of the Apple II was its sound capabilities. The computer had no dedicated sound chip. The speaker could be clicked at different lengths and speeds to produce sound effects, but they were very basic, and it took tremendous effort to make a program have motion and sound seemingly occur at the same time in games like Moon Patrol. Various sound cards soon emerged, like the Mockingbird, which could support 6 audio voices and speech synthesis. Here's an example of a game using that technology. The Alf Music card could support even more voices, and some beautiful arrangements were made for it, like this one by Bach. The Apple IIgs model supported this automatically. However, arguably the best quality sound would be produced courtesy of the Passport MIDI card, as demonstrated by Ultima V, heard here.
Most people wouldn't spend $10,000, for example, to have your dishes washed.
Aside from sound cards, there were all kinds of interesting add-ons being developed, some practical ones like the accelerator cards and SCSI controllers, and some curious ones like the Topo robot, released by Androbot in 1983, which was under the direction of Dr. Wily and Dr. Light. Oh wait, no, that's the plot for Mega Man. I mean, Nolan Bushnell. These things were destined for a life of servitude to the humans, but luckily for them, not too many sold.
Who's going to pay $1,600 for a home computer on wheels?
Now, people like me, children of the 80s and early 90s, probably weren't playing with expensive computer-controlled robots, but we were playing with lots of games, and the Apple II had thousands of them, many whose franchises still exist today. Some notable companies who got their start on the system include Sierra, Naughty Dog, Electronic Arts, Surtech, Origin, the founders of id Software like John Carmack, John Romero, and Tom Hall, even Will Wright, creator of The Sims and SimCity. All these folks cut their teeth on this machine. Here's some notable Apple II games, many of which debuted or were exclusive to the platform.
We gotcha!
Even to this day, games are still being produced and new hardware is still being made. Here's a Western RPG called Lawless Legends that's still in development, but in the meantime you can play recently made games like Flappelbird, Genius, or try one of my games like Lamb Chops or Retro Fever, which I co-wrote with another vintage computer enthusiast. Great companies like Beagle Brothers release programming utilities and aids which many folks, including myself, still use to this day, which is a real testament to the quality of their software. Beagle Brothers was actually headquartered right here in San Diego, my hometown, in one of the office buildings just behind me. Now, in a somewhat recent revelation, I learned that my dad back in the 80s had renovated their office, and he'd also done some work in Bert Kersey's home, the founder of the company. When I messaged Bert about this, he confirmed it, and he said that he still uses the desk that my dad built him all those years ago. Pretty cool stuff. To examine the complete history of the Apple II and all of its accomplishments would take too long of a video, so I'll leave it here, but I hope you enjoyed this look back at some awesome retro technology. Thanks for watching.